Good morning. Woke up just with thoughts, scrolling, kind of typical things that we can do, that we do. Grab the phone, look at random shit, see if anyone has acknowledged your signal, replied, commented, reacted, so on and so on. You know, even people that have a level of awareness are still subject to these stimulus, this arrangement of behavior. And it got me to thinking, about my participation as well as my awareness about how the system itself operates. Um, and I'm not even sure what I'm aiming to communicate here, but I know I had a thought. I'm just trying to follow that trail of that thought to communicate the signal that is contained within that thought. Essentially, what I want to communicate, and this is largely the products or the frameworks that I'm developing, is around pattern recognition. And I'm beginning to suspect that a lot of the complexities boil down to this capability of pattern recognition. And you reverse engineer it into the systems and frameworks that we engage with on a daily basis, such as the algorithm, being Facebook, Instagram, what have you. And inadvertently, what's taking place is that with the scrolling, you will have your mind, you don't know the way that your mind works. And so just like a car, like a guy would have a conniption if he were to know that you would put some other fluid other than fuel into, the gas chamber, um, because anxiety would immediately set in because you know that you put a foreign fuel or the wrong kind of liquid into, the engine. And that's a critical component, and that could cause, indefinite damage or expensive damage, so on and so on. You know, we are human beings, and while we are organic and we live within our consciousness, we still are very much a mechanism. And this is reinforced by the various systems that live within our bodies, skeletal system, respiratory system, nervous system, so on and so on. So that is my specialty. And this is what makes me, you know, rare, I should say, is because I have a very high level of pattern recognition. And I can seem very unforgiving or opinionated because what people aren't recognizing is that I have confidence as it relates to pattern consistency. Um, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the direct attack against your capacity to do what I do and why that's dangerous for the system. Because if you're recognizing the pattern, then you're going to change the behaviors. You only can get locked into the behaviors if you don't recognize the pattern. So, yeah, um, that's largely what my mission is to try to restore is the capacity for pattern recognition. But you can't do that until you can focus. And you can't focus until you've achieved some sort of, you know, anchor in terms of where your attention stand. Like, what do you stand? People like to say, I stand on business, I'm 10 toes down. These are expressions, but these expressions should relate to something, cognitively or spiritually mechanical. Where do you stand? Like, what holds you still? What's your reference point? And many of us don't have a reference point. We have a moving reference point based upon how we feel about the overall atmosphere and orientation. We are highly impacted by the fields that we operate within. If you are impacted by the field, then you have no host orientation. And if you have no host orientation, you're unstable. A double minded man is unstable in all of his ways. So God, you know, the paradox. And this is the cruelty of God in my mind. You know, and I have frustrations with him often, and I'm in arguments with the spirit about this dynamic because to a large extent it feels systemically unnecessary. Systemically it is unnecessary, but operationally it is necessary because, you know, you need feedback loops and you need consequences, you need deterrence, you need these things to have organic change. If you think about a system that bears intelligence, and how do you discipline a non-organic system? And I learn a great deal by looking at systems behavior, which is how in the recent years I've begun to teach myself because, you know, people are dishonest about the pattern that they reveal. Systems have no emotionality associated with it. However, there is a parallel between the two conditions because, like I said, the human itself is a system and the human responds to conditions because the human operates according to a system. You wouldn't be able to be controlled unless you had very specific, predictable behaviors. And because of those predictable behaviors, your enemy is able to recognize your pattern and therefore manipulate your behaviors and your outcomes. So when you have an associate like myself that's able to recognize these patterns and try to tell you, you're in complete disbelief because you are committed to the rhythm that they have learned about you that you like. You just like the song. You like it. You can't make distinctions, you know, and make declarations. You need to be guided and dictated like the Pied Piper, like they're playing a little tune and you just dance along. And that's the way you need it because you can't handle being in the, you know, in the paradox. You can't handle being in the conflict. And that becomes a greater strain to those of us that have that capacity because we're in the conflict, we're in the paradox alone. It was never meant for us to be in the paradox alone. You know, what's the scriptures that support this? You know, uh, the threefold cord is not quickly broken. You know, where two or more are gathered in my name. Um, you know, the kingdom. You know, it's you know, so it was always intended to be not about isolation. You know, forsake not the assembling of yourselves, and so on and so on. You know, and so those of us that have the gifts and the ability to have the sight to be able to give collective clarity, we're isolated because, you know, many of us are obsessed with the algorithm. We're obsessed because it's learned us so well that it tells us what we want to hear. And we've not grown comfortable with hearing the things that are uncomfortable to hear. And due to that absence of discipline, hearing the uncomfortable thing, not only just hearing the uncomfortable thing, but acknowledging the uncomfortable thing. And after the acknowledgement, processing, you know, the uncomfortable thing, and then adjusting according to the information. And that's repentance. You know, we just have lots of, and that's the thing that frustrates me so much too. You have to be able to recognize the patterns in terms and the way the terms are used, communication. Not that you have to do this. You don't need to do all of that. But because you're narcissistic and no one can tell you anything, you have to do it for yourself. When someone has a capacity and it's convenient for them to do it because they were built for that, they were made to do that. But because you don't trust them, the system has taught you not to trust what you should trust. The system has taught you to trust it versus what you should trust. So therefore it keeps you in constant confusion and you're its slave. And then you become an enemy to the person that's trying to reveal to you how you're captured. It's a beautiful fucking trap. It's a beautiful trap. And I say words like beautiful because, like I said, I love systems. I love the language of systems. Looking at systems is like poetry to me. And even if they're evil, I don't think about it that way because once you reach a certain level of consciousness, you don't look at good and evil the same way. You know, like I'm a full-blown villain and I don't mind it. You understand? I know why I am what I am, you know? So that still doesn't change the fact that I wish that I could have relatability with this awareness and concentrate power based upon that coherence. A nation divided against itself cannot stand.